Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We love to tackle those really complex topics in education, and today's deep dive is no exception. We're diving into the concept of what's called the ability achievement discrepancy.
Oh, yeah, big one.
It's a big one, and this is something that's been really central to understanding why some kids struggle in school, and particularly with reading.
Right.
And you shared some really thought-provoking material with me. One of the key articles that I read that really stuck with me was by Marianne S. Meyer in the Educational Psychology Review. And it got us thinking, does this idea that there's a big gap between a child's intelligence, which, we usually measure with things like IQ tests,
Right.
and how they're actually performing in school, does that really help us understand learning difficulties like dyslexia?
Yeah.
So, our mission today is to really unpack this idea, see where it came from, and why so many researchers are now questioning its value.
Exactly. This concept has shaped how learning disabilities and dyslexia in particular have been identified and addressed for decades. So, to really understand the current conversation around this, we need to go back and see how this idea first took root.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, where did this notion of needing this significant gap between how smart a child seems and how well they're doing in school, where did that come from?
Well, when the federal government started expanding educational services for children with learning disabilities back in the 1960s and 70s, a key requirement was this severe discrepancy between a child's potential, often gauged by an IQ test, and their actual achievements in the classroom.
Okay.
But the groundwork for this idea was actually laid even earlier, like way back in the late 19th century. Researchers back then started to notice something interesting.
Right.
Some children who seemed otherwise intelligent were having a really tough time learning to read.
Interesting. So, it was this sort of unexpected difficulty with reading in these seemingly bright children that really sparked their interest.
Precisely. Pioneers in the field, figures like Hinchelwood, Orton, and Fernald, observed that these were often curious and engaged children. Their struggles with reading just didn't seem to fit with their overall intelligence. So the thinking was that if a child with average or above average intelligence wasn't learning to read, it suggested a specific underlying issue,
Okay.
a learning disability.
Okay.
On the other hand, if a child with lower intelligence struggled, it was seen as more in line with expectations.
So, it was almost like they were saying if bright learning should come easily, and if it doesn't, there must be a specific problem.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
And the initial assumption was that these slow learners were fundamentally different from children with average intelligence who were also struggling with reading. And there was a study in the 1970s by Rudder and Yule that seemed to offer some support for this idea, suggesting potentially different neurological patterns in these two groups.
Interesting. Okay, so how did this discrepancy idea get written into the rules and regulations of the education system?
So in 1977, the U.S. Office of Education formally included the idea of a severe achievement ability discrepancy in their definition of a specific learning disability. It was intended to be a crucial way to identify these children. But here's where things get really interesting. The federal regulations didn't provide any specific formulas or clear numbers for actually measuring this discrepancy.
Oh, that sounds like a recipe for a lot of different interpretations.
You're absolutely right. Because there were no clear federal guidelines, individual states started creating their own criteria. By 1990, the vast majority of states, about 88%, were using some form of this discrepancy in their definitions or the criteria they used to identify learning disabilities. And even as recently as 1998, surveys showed that most states still relied on this model.
Wow. So
Yep.
the rules can be completely different depending on where a child lived. That example we talked about earlier, where a child moves between states and might lose access to support, that wasn't just a hypothetical situation then.
Not at all. It highlighted a very real and frustrating problem. A child could qualify for crucial support in one state, but not in another, simply because the required size of the gap between their IQ and their reading level was different.
And how are they actually trying to measure this gap? What kind of statistical tools were they using to figure out if a discrepancy existed?
Well, there were several different approaches. Some states used what were called expectancy formulas, which basically compared a child's reading level to what you might expect based on their age or grade.
Okay.
Others used more complex regression formulas that tried to take into account statistical factors.
Gotcha.
But the most common method, used by a significant number of states, was something called standard score discrepancy.
Okay, standard score discrepancy. What's the basic idea there?
Essentially, it involves looking at the difference in scores when a child takes an intelligence test and an achievement test in an area like reading. These scores are converted to a common scale so they can be compared. The underlying assumption was that the IQ score represented the child's potential, so it was expected to be the higher score. And states varied quite a bit on how big this difference needed to be. Some required a 15-point gap, others as much as 22 points, and some had other specific thresholds. This lack of consistency really highlights the problem with this approach.
So we have this historical background, the federal push for this idea, and then this whole mix of different state-level definitions, all built on this potentially shaky foundation. Now, what did the research start to uncover about whether this discrepancy model was actually a good way to understand learning disabilities?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting and where Meyer's article gives us a crucial overview. Beginning in the 1980s, research began to seriously question whether this discrepancy model was a valid way to understand and identify learning disabilities, particularly reading disabilities like dyslexia. And given that dyslexia makes up the majority of identified learning disabilities and has been extensively studied, it became a primary focus for examining these questions. Researchers started asking some really fundamental things.
Like what? What were some of the main concerns that began to emerge about this model?
Well, one major area of concern was the relationship between the specific cognitive skills that we know are essential for reading things like phonological awareness,
Right.
which is the ability to hear and manipulate the individual sounds within words, like recognizing the CAT sounds in cat
Yeah.
and rapid naming, being able to quickly name familiar objects or letters, and overall IQ. The research consistently showed that while these underlying weaknesses are strongly linked to reading difficulties, they often have a very minimal connection to standard measures of general intelligence.
So a child could have a completely average or even high IQ, but still have significant difficulties with those basic reading skills.
Exactly. And if those core reading skills are largely independent of IQ, then needing a gap between the two to identify a reading problem starts to seem less and less logical.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Another key question that arose was whether these slow learners, children with lower overall IQs who struggle with reading, are fundamentally different from students with average IQs who have reading disabilities. The discrepancy model basically assumes they are different.
Because the reading struggles of the slow learners are seen as more expected.
Right. But research, like the Connecticut longitudinal study, found that when you actually compare these two groups based on their reading-related skills, there often aren't significant differences in things like their language skills or phonological awareness. IQ seemed to account for most of the difference between the groups, suggesting that the underlying reasons for their reading difficulties might be quite similar regardless of their overall IQ. However, some researchers did report finding differences, noting a higher proportion of multiple cognitive challenges in the discrepant readers, which could lead to more severe difficulties. So this particular question is still being explored, with some arguing that the differences might be more about the severity or the combination of underlying issues.
That makes sense. So if the reason for the reading difficulty is similar in both groups, why should having a high IQ be necessary to qualify for help?
Yeah.
What about how stable a dyslexia diagnosis is when you're only looking at this discrepancy?
That's another really important point. Research that has followed children over time has shown that a dyslexia diagnosis that's based solely on this gap between IQ and achievement can be quite unreliable, especially for younger children. For example, one study found that only a small percentage of students who were identified as dyslexic in first grade using a discrepancy model were still classified that way in third grade.
Wow.
Things like the age at which they were identified, how severe their reading difficulties were initially, and even their educational experiences can all affect whether that discrepancy is present at any given time. And here's a really counterintuitive takeaway. Effective early intervention can sometimes actually reduce the discrepancy, which could then lead to a student paradoxically losing access to the very services that were helping them.
That's incredible. So if the help works and closes the gap, they might be considered no longer learning disabled, even though they might still need ongoing support to maintain that progress.
Exactly. It creates a situation where you almost need the child to keep struggling to remain eligible for help, which is clearly not the goal. Then there's the issue of how different dyslexia can look from one person to another. Research shows that there are many different underlying cognitive strengths and weaknesses that can lead to difficulties with reading.
Okay.
Some children might primarily struggle with phonological processing, while others might have more trouble with rapid naming or something called orthographic processing, which is how we recognize and remember written words.
Hmm.
The discrepancy model, by focusing on a single IQ score, doesn't really capture this complexity.
Right.
You can have very different kids with very different cognitive profiles, all meeting the same general criteria of having a certain gap between their IQ and their reading level.
So it's a very general way of looking at a really varied set of challenges.
Right.
What about the relationship between IQ and achievement itself? Is it as simple as the discrepancy model assumes?
Not at all. The research strongly suggests that the relationship between IQ and how well someone does in school, especially in reading, isn't a straightforward, direct one. Having a lower IQ doesn't automatically mean someone will have low achievement, and having a high IQ doesn't guarantee high achievement. We know many children with average or even slightly below average IQs can become quite skilled readers. And here's another fascinating point. Stanovich talked about something called the Matthew effect in reading.
Interesting.
Because children who struggle with reading tend to read less, they have fewer opportunities to build their vocabulary, their general knowledge, and even their verbal reasoning skills, all things that are often measured on IQ tests. So over time, reading difficulties can actually have a negative impact on IQ scores.
So the very thing they're using as the baseline for a child's potential can actually be affected by the very difficulty they're trying to identify. That's a real twist.
Yeah.
And finally, what have studies looking at genetics in the brain revealed about this discrepancy idea?
This is where the evidence really points away from a simple discrepancy being the central issue. Research in genetics and how the brain works provides strong evidence that dyslexia is often a brain-based condition with a biological origin. This means it's likely something a person is born with and has a neurological basis. Studies have identified potential genetic links to different aspects of reading, and brain imaging studies have shown differences in brain structure and activity in individuals with dyslexia, particularly in areas related to processing language. These findings suggest that dyslexia isn't just a matter of someone not living up to their potential, as measured by an IQ test. It's often related to fundamental differences in how their brains process language. As researchers like Stanovich and Siegel have pointed out, it's becoming increasingly unlikely that just looking at the gap between IQ and achievement can reliably identify a distinct group of children with reading disabilities who are different in terms of their behavior, their genes, or their brain function.
Okay, so the scientific basis for the discrepancy model seems to have some pretty significant weaknesses. But what does this look like in the real world? What are the practical downsides of using this model in schools?
The practical issues are just as concerning. One of the most significant is the wait to fail phenomenon. Because a child often needs to show a substantial gap between their IQ and their achievement to qualify for services. They can struggle for many years before that gap becomes large enough.
Right.
This delay not only makes successful intervention less likely, but can also seriously damage a child's self-confidence and motivation. It's heartbreaking to think of a child going through years of struggle, feeling like they're not capable, when in reality, the system itself is delaying the support they desperately need.
It really is tough to imagine a child feeling like they're just not smart enough when they might just learn differently.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even when a child is referred for evaluation, there can be problems with how that discrepancy is actually determined.
Okay.
Research has shown that school psychologists might not always have the in-depth statistical knowledge needed to accurately interpret test scores and identify meaningful discrepancies. Then you have school-based teams that make the final decisions about who gets services.
Right.
And studies have found a lot of inconsistency in how these teams apply the discrepancy criteria, with some students who meet the criteria not being identified and others being identified who don't actually meet it. Interestingly, some research suggests that just having low reading achievement, regardless of IQ, is sometimes the most consistent factor in how these teams decide on learning disability classifications. It almost sounds like the discrepancy is more of a hurdle to jump over than a reliable indicator of a child's actual learning needs.
It sounds like it. What about things like what a teacher thinks or where a child comes from? Do those factors play a role in who gets identified?
They absolutely can. A teacher's own beliefs about learning disabilities and their confidence in supporting struggling learners can influence whether they even refer a child for evaluation in the first place. And as we discussed earlier, the discrepancy criteria can vary a lot from one state to another, so a child's access to support can depend on something as arbitrary as their zip code. And research by Lester and Kelman also pointed out that broader socioeconomic factors, like a state's average income and the education levels of parents in the state, can be linked to the amount and type of learning disability services provided. They even found potential connections between things like poverty levels and the proportion of minority students in a state, and the likelihood of students being placed in more restrictive educational settings. This brings up serious questions about fairness and equal access to support.
That's really concerning. It sounds like the discrepancy model can unintentionally lead to unequal access to help for students who need it. You also mentioned that even when interventions are successful, it can create problems. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yes, it's a really problematic situation. If an intervention works well and a student's reading skills improve significantly, the gap between their improved reading achievement and their supposedly stable IQ score might shrink. And in the past, this has led to cases where a child, when reevaluated, no longer met the discrepancy criteria and was therefore taken out of special education services, even though they might still need ongoing support to maintain their reading progress. So the very success of the intervention could result in the withdrawal of the support that made that success possible, which obviously isn't in the child's best interest. It's like saying, you're better now, so we're taking away the tools that helps you get there.
Right. So if this discrepancy model has so many significant drawbacks, what are some of the alternative ways that researchers are suggesting we should identify and support struggling readers?
Your sources highlight several promising alternatives. One idea is to focus on the difference between a child's ability to understand language when they hear it, listening comprehension, and their ability to understand when they read it, reading comprehension. The thinking here is that listening comprehension can be a better indicator of a child's underlying language skills. And if they can understand complex ideas when they hear them but struggle when they read them, that points more directly to a reading-specific difficulty.
Okay.
However, this approach also has its challenges. We don't always have perfect ways to measure listening comprehension in standardized tests, and other factors like attention or auditory processing issues could also affect those scores. Plus, that Matthew effect we talked about earlier could potentially impact listening comprehension scores over time as well.
Okay, that makes sense. What's another alternative that's being considered?
Another proposal, strongly supported by researchers like Siegel, is to move away from relying on IQ scores altogether and focus solely on directly assessing those fundamental reading skills, specifically how well a child can recognize words and decode unfamiliar words.
Okay.
The idea is that if a child scores significantly below their peers on these core reading abilities, that's the primary sign of a reading disability, regardless of their IQ. While this approach has the advantage of being straightforward and directly targeting reading skills, it might not fully capture the range of reading difficulties, such as problems with reading fluency or understanding what they've read, even if their word recognition is adequate.
And the third main alternative you mentioned.
That's the response to intervention, or RTI, approach.
Okay.
This model shifts the focus to how a child responds to high-quality, research-based instruction. Instead of looking for a gap between IQ and achievement, the RTI model involves screening all students, providing targeted support to those who are struggling in the classroom, and then carefully monitoring how they progress. The learning disability might be considered if a child doesn't make expected progress, despite receiving multiple levels of increasingly intensive and validated interventions. This approach has the potential to identify struggling learners much earlier and provide support proactively, rather than waiting for a significant discrepancy to develop. The beauty of RTI is that it doesn't rely on a potentially flawed comparison of unrelated skills. Instead, it directly looks at whether a child is learning to read when given appropriate instruction. If they're not making progress despite good teaching, that's a much more direct indicator of a potential learning difficulty.
The RTI approach sounds really promising because it's about actually trying to help the child and seeing if it makes a difference rather than just comparing scores on different kinds of tests.
Exactly. It moves away from a static assessment of a supposed gap to a more dynamic understanding of how a child learns best.
So, looking towards the future, what do the authors of these sources suggest as the best way forward for identifying and supporting struggling readers?
The general agreement seems to be a shift towards earlier identification and intervention. This involves directly assessing those underlying cognitive skills that are so important for reading, as well as a child's basic reading abilities themselves, and then carefully tracking their progress over time. The RTI model, while still needing clear guidelines and measurement methods, holds a lot of promise in this area. Ultimately, the authors emphasize that changing the long-standing reliance on the discrepancy model within the education system will require collaborative effort from parents, educators, researchers, and policymakers. This change needs to be driven by a clear understanding of the significant benefits, both for the individual and for society, of providing early and effective support to all children who are struggling with reading. It really seems like a fundamental shift is needed, moving away from this idea of waiting for a gap to appear and instead focusing on identifying and addressing reading difficulties as early as possible. It's about being proactive rather than reactive, and about ensuring that all children get the right support at the right time.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into a complex topic. It's clear that while the ability achievement discrepancy model played a significant role historically, it has some serious limitations and can unfortunately have negative consequences for students. The alternative approaches you've outlined offer some much-needed hope for a more effective and fair way to support struggling readers.
Absolutely. The research is guiding us towards a more nuanced and responsive approach that focuses on directly assessing reading skills and how a child responds to targeted instruction.
So, on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. If intelligence tests don't fully capture the specific cognitive skills that are needed for reading, and if difficulties with reading can actually impact how someone's cognitive abilities develop, how might our entire understanding of learning potential need to evolve to better support individuals facing these challenges?
That's a powerful question that really makes you think about some fundamental assumptions we hold about learning and intelligence.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. Until our next exploration.